Well, it's great to see all of you here tonight, our winners, parents, friends of the Overseas Press Club Foundation. I see representatives of the Toppin clan are here, Toppin clan. And my name is John Danishevsky, and I'm president of the foundation. We will have time after the ceremony to continue mingling and connecting, and I hope we'll keep doing that. So first of all, a big welcome. This is our second live reception for our winners since the COVID epidemic, and my first as president. I think you'll agree that we have an impressive group of young people this year who have prepared themselves and aspire to the great and noble vocation of being international correspondents, helping to bring the world closer. And believe me, in these times, we need that. Before we launch this evening, I want to take at least a minute to honor my predecessor as president, Bill Holstein. Bill, could you stand up? He's in the back there. Bill guided the OPC Foundation for 27 years, since 1996. He has been the driving force. It is no exaggeration to credit him for making this organization what it is today. His zeal for helping young journalists get started is unmatched. A former correspondent himself for UPI, he is also the author of 10 books. I don't know when he finds the time. His most recent came out last year, and it's a very important book. It's called Battlefield Cyber: How China and Russia Are Undermining Democracy and National Security. So please give it up for Bill. And I know that although he's no longer president, he will continue to advocate for more opportunities for the next generation of foreign correspondents. I also want to thank our foundation's tireless executive director, Jane Riley, and our associate director, Kat Riley, who are equally both passionate for the cause and hard at work modernizing the organization going forward. And I would like to thank them both for some unsung work. Over the last 8 years, they've helped our partner organization, the ACOS Alliance. ACOS stands for A Culture of Safety. OPC Foundation was the fiscal sponsor for ACOS. It's an international group devoted to enhancing safety of freelance and local journalists. ACOS is now striking out on its own, but we are very proud at the foundation to have helped them over the past 8 years, helped them get started, and now they're well established and on their own. I also want to acknowledge our board, our wonderful board at the OPC Foundation. We welcome to the board tonight 2 new members, Paul Haven of the Associated Press and Andrea Berg of Mercedes-Benz North America. And Andrea, could you stand up? Oh, there she is. Paul is not here tonight because he's working on Super Tuesday News. And could our other board members stand up and get a round of applause for their work, including choosing this year's wonderful group of winners? I know a lot of you are here, so board members. Now, some of this year's winners will be going to news organizations, to AP, Reuters, the Wall Street Journal, among others, and we hope that will be springboards for long-term careers at those newsrooms. Others will use their scholarships for independent reporting. They're all going to do great things, and you will meet them shortly. We also have about 10 former winners of our prizes attending tonight. One of them, Jesse Coburn, has just won a George Polk Award for local reporting. He did. He did an investigation into New York City's black market for temporary license plates. And that was for a newsroom I hadn't heard of, Streets Blog, New York City. And you may have noticed that another of our recent winners, Valerie Hopkins, who covers Russia and Ukraine for the New York Times, she had the page 1 byline Friday for her moving account of the Alexei Navalny funeral in Moscow. We honor Alexei Navalny for his courage and for the journalists who are covering the wars in Ukraine and in Russia and Gaza and Israel. But anyway, Jesse and Valerie are just two of the many examples of how we at OPC Foundation have helped launch successful journalism careers, and I expect the same for our group tonight. So now, ladies and gentlemen, here are the evening's winners. They are all here in person. We will show their personal videos, and I ask you to please, they're all worthy of applause, but I ask you to please hold your applause until after the videos, and then I'll come back after that. So.
I wanted to be a foreign correspondent since I was 9 years old, and I met James Foley. James was a family friend and journalist who covered the Middle East. And when I met him, he encouraged me to always keep writing. He became my inspiration. When James was killed in Syria by ISIS, I knew I wanted to walk the path he couldn't finish. His reporting often told the stories and empowered the voices of those most affected by tragedy. But he also told stories of beauty and calm mixed with those harsh realities of war and mayhem. In the summer of 2023, I traveled to Tunisia to report on migration. When I arrived, I found that the landscape was much more complex than I had originally thought. And rather than try to conflate all the unique stories of migration into one, I thought, what would James Foley do? He'd tell stories. He'd let voices be heard. And so I decided that's what I would do. So I profiled a teenager who tried to cross the Mediterranean in an inflatable kayak, but was picked up by the Tunisian Coast Guard. He spent 19 days in prison, but still intends to try to cross again. I wrote about a hairdresser from Ivory Coast who spends 8 hours a day braiding hair after her morning shift as a maid. This practice of braiding helps some Black Tunisians revive lost culture. And I told the story of a pregnant Nigerian woman who was faced with insufficient medical care at a migrant camp in Tunis. In Tunisia, I grappled with my duty to tell difficult, impactful stories while still representing the beautiful country and community there. These complex stories, the stories of people uniquely affected by tragedy, are the ones I plan to continue to tell with the generous help of the OPC Foundation. Thank you.
My name is Catherine Cartier, and I'm an MA candidate in global journalism at NYU. I got my first taste of journalism while studying Arabic in Amman, Jordan as a Davidson College sophomore. There, I met a talented Syrian storyteller who volunteered her time to share folktales with displaced children. My first byline was in the New Arab, where I wrote about her efforts to instill a love of storytelling in a new generation. My undergraduate studies continued in Morocco, Lebanon, and Tajikistan. I covered the environment, education, and youth culture, often carrying out interviews in Arabic. In 2019, I received a fellowship from the Pulitzer Center to spend 6 weeks hiking in Lebanon and interviewing religious leaders about conservation efforts. While covering many topics, conflict and how it had shaped the lives of many people I interviewed emerged as a common theme. That led to my ongoing interest in reporting on why conflict happens. After graduating, I spent 2 years at a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., C4ADS, where I investigated financial networks in conflict zones. I obtained corporate and property records from everywhere from Hong Kong to Cyprus and traced over $150 million in transnational financial flows. I loved follow the money investigations, and so in 2023, I decided to pursue my master's in journalism. As a journalist, my goal is to combine my investigative and language skills to report from North Africa, the Levant, the Gulf, or Central Asia. I would like to thank the Overseas Press Club Foundation for helping me to work towards this goal.
My name is Simar Bajaj, and I am a student at Harvard, a Marshall Scholar, and a science journalist. I grew up in the Bay Area, the child of 2 Indian immigrants, set on being a doctor. In fact, I only started journalism less than 2 years ago, having never worked in my high school or college paper. But after taking a narrative nonfiction class with science journalist Michael Pollan, I was inspired to try and follow in his footsteps. Unfortunately, I was rejected from every internship I applied to. So as a last resort, I spent summer 2022 freelancing. Ultimately, I wrote stories for the Washington Post, Time, and The Atlantic on everything from bladder cancer surgery to machine learning algorithms for sepsis. My favorite piece, however, was on the science, history, and ethics of pig-to-human transplants for The Guardian. I got to spend 12 hours in an operating room at Stanford Hospital, peeking over the drapes as the team replaced the patient's heart. This was a normal human-to-human transplant, but it allowed me to help readers envision the future. To my surprise, this piece ended up winning Science Story of the Year from the Foreign Press Association and a $40,000 award for excellence in science communications from the National Academies of Science. Over that summer, I also discovered an interest in stigmatized diseases, such as obesity and lung cancer, where patients are blamed for their conditions. I'm determined to report on how these diseases have played out internationally, since the tobacco and processed food industries have global reach. And I've seen this firsthand, reporting on tobacco regulations everywhere from Brookline, Massachusetts to Christchurch, New Zealand. This summer, I plan to report on stigmatized diseases in East Africa and Southeast Asia, highlighting regions either succeeding or struggling to treat these conditions. Thank you so much to the OPC Foundation for this wonderful honor.
Hi, I'm Kate Selig. When working as an intern at the Boston Globe, my editor sent me to cover the effects of the summer's first heat wave on Chinatown, the city's hottest neighborhood. Through my reporting, I met Liang Yan, an elderly woman who carried home a bucket of ice when it got too hot. I interviewed her in her cramped, stifling apartment, and through an interpreter, she told me about how she used the ice to stay cool. She said that every year the heat seems to get worse and worse, but what can she do? That's just how life is, she said. Though Miss Yan was resigned to her situation, readers were not. Soon after the publication of the article, community members flooded my inbox with emails asking what they could do to help. They eventually raised a few $1,000s for Miss Yan and other Chinatown residents. Through writing this article, I saw the impact that climate reporting can have firsthand, learning how finding the stories of climate change's ramifications on everyday people has the power to make change. I want to continue telling these stories, and for this reason, I've made climate the focus of my work. Since my summer at the Globe, I went on to intern with the climate teams at the San Francisco Chronicle and the Washington Post. And this fall, I was recognized as one of 2 Student Journalists of the Year by covering Climate Now, a global journalism organization co-founded by the Columbia Journalism Review. After I graduate from Stanford in the spring, my hope is to eventually report on climate from around the world. I'm grateful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for their support for my career, and I'm excited to see what comes next.
My name is Trisha Mukherjee, and I'm a student at Columbia Journalism School. Even though she lives 8,000 miles away, my grandma is one of my best friends. She was born in a peaceful village in Bengal, where she lived until one horrific day in 1947. The British had just split India into 2 separate countries, one for Hindus and one for Muslims, and my grandma and her family were on the wrong side. Amidst communal violence, they fled as their house burst into flames behind them. Luckily, my grandma made it. But what about those who didn't survive? A few years ago, I spent months traveling around India, documenting the stories of the remaining partition survivors, most of them in their 80s or 90s. Sometimes my grandma came with me. The survivors told us stories of lost family members, shattered dreams, and this endless longing for a home they could never return to. As a journalist, I've continued telling stories about home and migration. Most recently, I traveled to both sides of the US-Mexico border to talk to families who had lost their loved ones as they crossed the desert. As I shadowed search and rescue groups and watched an artist plant a cross to memorialize unidentified remains, I was told time and time again by families that the best way we can help them shoulder their grief and loss, whether in Mexico, India, or anywhere else in the world, is to tell their stories. Thank you so much to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for helping me continue bringing these stories to light.
In August, at 5:30 in the morning, I woke up and drove 2 hours with another reporter to witness a demonstration in Swellendam, South Africa. Just 1 week earlier, protesters had burned down a municipal building in the same community. They were angry over the government's failure to deliver them basic services like electricity. Violence did not break out at that rally, but for me it was a crash course on South African protest culture and how apartheid's legacy lives on in the country. I felt ready to stay in South Africa and hone my skills in a country so full of stories to tell. The day of the rally was only my second day reporting for a nonprofit news organization in Cape Town. I spent the fall jumping headfirst into new situations and never letting my unfamiliarity with the languages, politics, or culture deter me. I wrote about a mother who was so gravely affected by a growing hunger crisis in eastern South Africa that she killed herself and her 3 children because she could not feed them. I profiled residents who were trying to pick up the pieces of their lives after severe flooding destroyed their homes and their settlements. And I interviewed school principals in rural villages about their struggle to teach children in harsh conditions with no government assistance. My experience in South Africa covering protests, hunger, floods, and inequity is the impetus for my career in international reporting. I am so thankful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for the opportunity to launch that career.
Hello, my name is Sam Harshbarger. I'm a senior at Princeton University studying history. My journey to foreign correspondency began at the end of middle school when I won an essay contest organized through the student exchange organization AFS to travel to central Russia to document indigenous Udmurt communities. Returning to Russia twice more in high school for language study, I became fascinated by the historical legacies and present-day realities of ethno-nationalist conflict across the former Soviet Union and broader Eurasia. After high school, over a gap year, I traveled to the southeastern Turkish city of Gaziantep, where I worked with the Syrian American organization on cross-border humanitarian assistance in northwestern Syria. I was fascinated by Turkey's complicated history and politics, and returned countless times over my college years, working with the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the New Lines Institute to research and write on domestic political transformation and ambitious foreign policy objectives in Turkey under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Going forward, I hope to tell the stories of transnational politics that cross the traditional boundaries of the former Soviet Union and the Middle East from Istanbul to international students studying in Turkey, refugees who fled there, and the Turkish construction, entertainment, and technology companies that have taken the world by a storm. I'm very thankful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for the opportunity to bring the regional expertise I've developed into the field of journalism this coming summer. I look forward to meeting you all over the course of today's events. Thank you so much.
In the summer of 2022, I went on a jungle expedition to Panama and embedded with indigenous groups. In one particular village, something remarkable happened. It was a tourism-centered settlement in the Chagres National Park. My fellow expeditioners felt uncomfortable being there. The experience wasn't authentic, and our presence there was invasive. They wanted to leave. This only worsened when we found a roster with the names of the children who were supposed to play with us, the foreigners. Later, the villagers told me that the government had banned hunting and agriculture in their land, that their only alternative to integrating into cities and staying in their villages was to open them to tourism. They needed electricity for children to study after dark so they may one day become leaders, fighting for their collective rights. It was then that I realized how the narratives we built had misguided us. They needed tourism to save their traditions, and children were an important part of that. I am myself mestizo, of European and indigenous descent. From my native land, I have experienced how colonizing narratives allowed for atrocities to be committed against my people. In today's context, Indigenous livelihoods are too often romanticized on the one hand, or catastrophized on the other, all to fit into one mold. And when reality doesn't conform, discomfort ensues. I want to tell stories that break this mold, empowering not by virtue of embellishing reality, but by narrating truth with sensitivity to context. Ultimately, I hope to change minds, hearts, and actions. I am excited to use the opportunities given to me by the OPC Foundation to fulfill this goal. Thank you.
This is my younger cousin Hasset. Most of my family lives in Ethiopia, so Hasset and I only got to meet after I saved up enough money to fly there when I was 15. She was sweet and sturdy and never let me help with any of her chores. Hasset never got to be in her 20s. She died when she was just a teenager in the deadliest war of the 21st century, the war in Tigray, Ethiopia, in which about 800,000 civilians have been killed. The war in Tigray broke out in November 2020. That day, a complete telecommunications and power blackout cut Tigray off from the rest of the world. For the 2 years that it lasted, I couldn't know if my grandparents or little cousins were alive. All I knew is that they were living in a war zone and on their own. The summer after the war in Ethiopia broke out, I interned with the Washington Post. The piece from my time there, that I'm the proudest of, broke the news that the Ethiopian government was blockading humanitarian and medical aid meant for Tigray, where 5 million people were starving. Interviewing UN workers on the ground, I learned that armed soldiers were turning away trucks full of food and medical aid at every checkpoint into Tigray. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people ultimately starved to death, simply because they were the wrong ethnicity. When I think of my younger cousin Hasset, I feel a deep sense of duty. I know that my life's work is reporting on places where people are suffering, especially where no one seems to care. And I'm eternally grateful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for seeing the value in this work. Thank you.
My name is Coral Murphy Marcos, and I'm at UC Berkeley. In 2017, Hurricane Maria devastated my hometown and university, both in Puerto Rico. My family endured 5 months without electricity or water. I, as a reporter for a local newspaper, covered the injustices brought by the hurricane while supporting my family through these very tough times. I eventually was accepted to Brown University's Hurricane Relief Program for the students at the University of Puerto Rico. I learned all about the hardships that people displaced by climate change face, such as adapting to cultural shock and speaking a non-native language. My ability to adapt was once again put to the test, this time as a reporting fellow for the New York Times. When the existing Wall Street correspondent resigned, my editors looked around the room and said, "Godard can do it." I had no clue at first, but seemingly overnight, I transformed into an expert on the intricacies of global markets. I had millionaires on the phone asking me, a 24-year-old at the time, for the best financial advice. I'm determined to continue reporting from the ground, focusing on environmental business hotspots in Latin America. I want to explain the unseen effects that public policies have on the environment and marginalized communities. Because if we can't do that, you'll be seeing millions more displaced by climate change in the United States, just like me. Thank you.
I am an explorer. I grew up in Colorado's Rocky Mountains, where curiosity was my playground. My environment granted me access to endless expeditions. And behind me, that's my latest conquest, Mount of the Holy Cross. My thirst for exploration and adventure has me constantly asking questions and chasing answers, no matter how difficult the task. That's why journalism is my chosen career and path. That's how I stumbled across my story, Odyssey of the Trans-Panama Trail. This summer, I read a story by Reuters outlining the intersection of tourism and migration through the Darien Gap. The Darien is a dense and dangerous stretch of jungle that connects Colombia to Panama. Though noteworthy for its struggling migrants, ambitious hikers are taking to the jungle too. I was curious. Why are people with Patagonia backpacks vacationing through a humanitarian crisis? I knew I had to look for a deeper story. So I contacted Rick Morales, tour guide cited in the Reuters story. He was quick to reply. Initially, my story was about Rick and others who were mapping a trail through the Darien to increase Panamanian tourism. But after hours of Zoom calls and archival research, I found so much more. I read about how two men mapped a nation, and in the process faced hurdles of red tape, an immigration crisis, and the disappearance of $54 million. As I head to Buenos Aires this spring to study and report on the Argentine economy, I am deeply grateful to the OPC Foundation for the opportunity this award has given me.
Hi, I'm Hannah Catherine Valles. I'm a photojournalist, a Texan, and recent graduate of the Craig Newmark School of Journalism. Before grad school, I lived and worked in Kenya for 3 years. So, what prompted my turn to journalism? It began with a desire to share my life in Kenya with my friends and family back home in the States. I did this by making photos. These photos became a visual record of life in Kenya, and my loved ones became more engaged, informed, and invested in the stories I was documenting. I watched apathy turn to empathy in real time, and there was a word for what I was doing: photojournalism. Since then, I've reported stories on migration, religious nationalism, and deepened my visual practice as an intern with National Geographic. Last summer, I traveled to Paris, where I captured a photo story about West African tailors working in the city. Drawing on my experience wandering Nairobi's garment district, I knew that tailoring co-ops have emerged as supportive spaces for recently arrived migrants in France. These tailors told me about their perilous journeys across land and water, but also what came after, the difficulties they faced and their hard-won success. They affirmed that depicting people in their most challenging moments is just as essential and luminous as showing what happens next. As I build my career, I'm committed to letting these values guide my reporting and image making around the world. Thank you.
I have long been immersed in the world of international journalism. I was born in Rome to 2 foreign correspondents and spent my early years in Johannesburg as my parents captured the buoyant days of a post-apartheid South Africa. We eventually settled in New York City, where in an act of adolescent resistance, I ventured out and majored in economics. My first job was at the U.S. Department of the Treasury analyzing international financial transactions. But ultimately, my journalistic genes persisted. I decided to pursue graduate studies at the University of Oxford, where I could deepen my knowledge of global economics and finance. Now, I'm equipped with not only a journalistic curiosity, but also with the tools to understand and explain the world of economics and finance. I went to Lebanon, where I spent a month reporting out of Beirut on the country's devastating financial crisis. I became fascinated with trying to understand how Riyad Salameh, the country's former central bank governor and once internationally celebrated financial guru, could descend so dramatically into a disgraced and reviled figure. Salameh, who brandished a celebratory cigar on his final day in office, essentially set up a giant Ponzi scheme that bankrupted his country. More recently, I took this approach to Argentina, which is experiencing an acute economic crisis of its own. I reported out of Buenos Aires during the inauguration of Javier Milei on the roots of the libertarian movement in the country and its intersection and influence on the new president's free market ideology. This is what I want to do with the rest of my life. Take complex economic and financial issues that may seem incomprehensible and translate them in terms that everyone can understand. From financial leaders abusing their power to economic crises that can devastate a country, there is no shortage of challenges stemming from our globalized, interconnected modern world. My goal is to bring a degree of accountability and transparency to these pressing issues.
Hi, my name is Laura Robertson and I'm a senior at Princeton. During college, I've fallen in love with studying Persian, a beautiful language with whimsical idioms and gorgeous literature. Now, not to make anyone feel old, but I was born 8 days after 9/11, so conflict with Iran and Afghanistan has really been the backdrop of my childhood. So like most American college students who want to study Persian full-time, last summer I found myself in the other Persian-speaking country, Tajikistan. Tajikistan seems to me to be an invisible center of the world, and I'm here in part to convince you of that. It has political issues. The Pamir Mountains have a separatist movement, and the president's face decorates buildings on most blocks. But Tajikistan is also a Persian-speaking former Soviet state that borders China and Afghanistan, which puts it at the center of the power dynamics between Russia, Iran, the US, and China. China is investing economically through its Belt and Road Initiative. Russian remittances make up over a third of the country's GDP. Iran recently began producing drones in the country. But perhaps most interestingly, all of these powers are involved together in guarding the country's 800-mile border with Afghanistan, and they all have different priorities. If we want to understand the complex power dynamics playing out in this region, this is the place where we're best suited to do it. Thank you.
I'm Marc Banchereau, a recent graduate from the Craig Newmark Grad School of Journalism at CUNY. For almost a year, I reported on the mobilization of Senegalese New Yorkers in support of a jailed opposition leader in their home country. As a Frenchman, I was naturally regarded with suspicion when I first started to report on this community, but by continuously showing up and reporting with empathy, I was able to gain their trust and give them a platform to have their voices heard. When violent protests broke out in Senegal in the summer of 2023, drawing international attention to the country, my sources were able to put me in touch with activists on the ground who claimed to have been arbitrarily detained and brutalized by security forces and militias. But why is this coverage important? The case of government crackdown on activists, journalists, and opposition members is not just limited to Senegal. It's a trend that has become all too common in West Africa. And with the growing number of migrants from this region coming to Europe and the United States, these stories are also our own. As a foreign correspondent, I want to help my readers understand the political and economic context that drives people to undertake this difficult and dangerous journey. I would like to thank the CUNY J School and the Overseas Press Club Foundation for helping me reach this goal.
I'm Paige Cromley. I'm a senior studying astrophysics at Princeton, and I write about science. I grew up in Houston, Texas, home to Great Barbecue and also NASA's Johnson Space Center. A field trip here in second grade inspired my love for the stars. In my time at Princeton, I've traveled all over the world to report on observatories. Most recently, I was in a mining town in Japan, about 200 miles northwest of Tokyo, writing about gravitational wave and neutrino detection facilities buried underneath Mount Ikeno. One of my first global experiences was in Chile, where I created a podcast for the Atacama Large Millimeter/Submillimeter Array. I got to travel to the desert, where the telescope is, and interview Chilean engineers, medics, and hospitality staff about life at the research complex. The experience inspired me to learn Spanish, and it also taught me to start writing more stories about humans, instead of just planets and telescopes. Because while I have always loved looking up at the stars, I'm also fascinated by what is happening down here on Earth. I want to focus my reporting on the ways people are experiencing widespread environmental shifts, particularly Indigenous communities on the front lines of climate change. I want to include the science, but also focus on the complex cultural, political, and economic ramifications. Last summer, I traveled to the Faroe Islands, a windy archipelago north of Denmark, to report on a traditional whale hunt there, a hunt which has been heavily criticized by outsiders for environmental and animal rights concerns. I knew I needed to report on it from all angles, so I talked to scientists about sustainability. I interviewed the local sheriff about hunting regulations. I went to sea with fishermen to talk about their livelihoods and their heritage, and I embedded with animal rights activists trying to document the hunt. I learned how to cover a complex, controversial issue responsibly. I also gained confidence in my own independence as I hitchhiked through tunnels from island to island. I hope to continue writing about similar, multifaceted topics with a focus on environmental changes. Thank you so much to the Overseas Press Club for the opportunity to continue reporting these stories around the world.
Hi, my name is Jade Lozada, and I'm a junior at Harvard College studying social studies and Slavic languages and literature. I also work for the Harvard Crimson as a news reporter and magazine editor, where I have covered the university's investments in Brazilian farmland, its adherence to the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, body snatching from Harvard Medical School's morgue, and the wake of the affirmative action ruling, for which I interviewed 4 members of Congress. Last summer, I also interned at the Georgian news website Civil GE, based out of Tbilisi. I covered pro-democracy organizing and the organization of the city's LGBT Pride Week, and much of my reporting related to Russia's disinformation campaigns against Western governments and liberal values. That summer, I also freelanced for the Moscow Times and The Nation, for which I covered Russian migration to Tbilisi. Primarily, I focused on migrants who are against the war and against Putin, but nevertheless are contributing to gentrification in Georgia, a country that was so recently invaded by Russia itself. Now, this summer, I hope to continue that work. I speak Russian, and I'm also familiar with Polish and Czech, and I hope to cover Russia from a news agency based in Central Asia or Eastern Europe. Thank you so much to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for sponsoring my summer project.
My name is Brunella Tipismana, and I'm a student at Yale University. I was born in a working-class family in Lima, Peru. When people tell me that journalism is a difficult industry, I am not fazed. 2 years ago, over Christmas, I learned about the largest massacre in modern Peruvian history over my family's WhatsApp group chat. The messages started arriving. 2 people killed by the police, 5, 10, 18, over 100 people were injured in what would become the biggest episode of political violence of the past 20 years. Supported by the North American Council for Latin America, I started to report on this crisis and on the ways that media has shaped it. In Peru, one family owns 80% of the print market, and the top 4 TV channels own 50% of the audience share. This lack of pluralism led to widespread censorship of state brutality outside of Lima. What had engulfed the country, endemic corruption, atomized parties, and political violence, was not a dictatorship, it was something murkier. It was the failure of a state. What's more, what happened in Peru was also happening in Brazil, Myanmar, and Somalia. I realized then that I needed to dedicate my time to strengthening our shared civil and political values in a world where technology and totalitarian impulses seem to tear it apart. So when people tell me that journalism is a difficult industry, I am not fazed. I have seen how high the stakes are, and I know now that no price is too high when it comes to preserving it. Thank you.
Those are really wonderful, wonderful videos, and they worked on the videos very hard, and I think they presented themselves very well. I wanted to mention that we have some big plans for this year at OPC Foundation. We are going to be, for the first time, offering traveling grants primarily for former OPC Foundation winners to continue their reporting projects outside. And we also, for the first time, will have a fellowship dedicated to covering Eastern and Central Europe, which is such an important part of the world to me. And it's in honor of Rob Urban, a journalist, and his late journalist, and his former wife, Laura Zelenko, and Bloomberg have helped to create this fellowship. So I think we can expect wonderful things from it. Now, if you support this kind of work, I wanted to call your attention on the back of the program to this QR code where you can donate to us. But mostly we're just here not so much to raise money, but to celebrate these wonderful young people. So thank you again, and we want their families and the winners to come together and for photos now, and then please just mingle, have another drink and appetizers. And for those of you in the room who are with news organizations, please help these young people's dreams come true. Thank you.